Mort. Part 5. By myself? Said Mort.
Certainly. I have every faith in you.
Gosh. The suggestion put everything else out of Mort's mind, and he was rather surprised that he didn't feel particularly squeamish. He'd seen quite a few deaths in the last week or so, and all the horror went out of it when you knew you'd be speaking to the victim afterwards. Most of them were relieved, one or two of them were angry, but they were all glad of a few helpful words.
Think you can do it?
Well, sir, yes, I think.
That's the spirit. I've left Binky by the horse trough around the corner. Take him straight home when you've finished.
You're staying here, sir? Death looked up and down the street, his eyes sockets flared.
I thought I might stroll around a bit, he said mysteriously. I don't seem to feel quite right. I could do with the fresh air.
He seemed to remember something, reached into the mysterious shadows of his cloak, and pulled out 3 hourglasses.
All straightforward, he said. Enjoy yourself.
He turned and strode off down the street, humming. Thank you, said Mort. He held the hourglasses up to the light, noting that one was on its very last few grains of sand. Does this mean I'm in charge? He called. But Death had already turned the corner. Binky greeted him with a faint whinny of recognition. Mort mounted up, his heart pounding with apprehension and responsibility. His fingers worked automatically, taking the scythe out from its sheath, adjusting and locking the blade, which flashed steely blue in the night, slicing the starlight like salami. He mounted carefully, wincing at the stab from his saddle sores, but Binky was like riding a pillow. As an afterthought, drunk with delegated authority, he pulled Death's riding cloak out of its saddlebag and fastened it by its silver brooch. He took another look at the first hourglass and nudged Binky with his knees. The horse sniffed the chilly air and began to trot. Behind them, Codwell burst out of his doorway, accelerating down the frosty street with his robes flying out behind him. Now the horse was cantering, widening the distance between its hooves and the cobbles. With a swish of its tail it cleared the housetops and floated up into the chilly sky. Codwell ignored it. He had more pressing things on his mind. He took a flying leap and landed at full length in the freezing waters of the horse trough, lying back gratefully among the bobbing ice splinters. After a while the water began to steam. Mort kept low for the sheer acceleration of the speed. The sleeping countryside roared soundlessly underneath. Binky moved at an easy gallop, his great muscles sliding under his skin as easily as alligators of a sandbank, his mane whipping in Mort's face. The night swirled away from the speeding edge of the scythe, cut into 2 curling halves. They sped under the moonlight as silent as a shadow, visible only to cats and people who dabbled in things men were not meant to ward off. Mort couldn't remember afterwards, but very probably he laughed. Soon the frosty plains gave way to broken lands around the mountains, and then the marching ranks of the ram-tops themselves raced across the world towards them. Binky put his head down and opened his stride, aiming for a path between 2 mountains as sharp as goblin teeth in the silver light. Somewhere a wolf howled. Mort took another look at the hourglass. Its frame was carved with oak leaves and mandrake root. The sand inside, even by moonlight, was pale gold. By turning the glass this way and that, he could just make out a name, Ameline Hamstring, etched in the faintest of lines. Binky slowed to a canter. Mort looked down at the roof of a forest, dusted with snow that was either early or very, very late. It could have been either, because the ram-tops hoarded their weather and doled it out with no real reference to the time of year. A gap opened up beneath them. Binky slowed again, wheeled around and descended towards a clearing that was white with drifted snow. It was circular, with a tiny cottage in the exact middle. If the ground around it hadn't been covered in snow, Mort would have noticed that there were no tree stumps to be seen. The trees hadn't been cut down in a circle. They had simply been discouraged from growing there, or had otherwise moved away. Candlelight spilled from one downstairs window, making a pale orange pool on the snow. Binky touched down smoothly and trotted across the freezing crust without sinking. He left no hoofprints, of course. Mort dismounted and walked towards the door, muttering to himself and making experimental sweeps with the scythe. The cottage roof had been built with wide eaves to shed snow and to cover the log pile. No dweller in the high ram-tops would dream of starting a winter without a log pile on 3 sides of the house. But there wasn't a log pile here, even though spring was still a long way off. There was, however, a bundle of hay in a net by the door. It had a note attached, written in big, slightly shaky capitals. "For the horse." It would have worried Mort if he'd let it. Someone was expecting him. He learned in recent days, though, that rather than drown in uncertainty, it was best to surf right up over to the top of it. Anyway, Binky wasn't worried about moral scruples and bit straight in. It did leave the problem of whether to knock. Somehow it didn't seem appropriate, supposing no one answered or told him to go away. So he lifted the thumb latch and pushed at the door. It swung inwards quite easily without a creak. There was a low-ceilinged kitchen, its beams at trepanning height for Mort. The light from the solitary candle glinted off crockery on a long dresser and flagstones that had been scrubbed and polished into iridescence. The fire in the cave-like ingle nook didn't add much light, because it was no more than a heap of white ash under the remains of a log. Maud knew, without being told, that this was the last log. An elderly lady was sitting at the kitchen table, writing furiously with her hooked nose only a few inches from the paper. A grey cat curled on the table beside her blinked calmly at Mort. The scythe bumped off a beam, and the woman looked up. "Be with you in a minute," she said. She frowned at the paper. "I haven't put the bit in about being of sound mind and body yet. Lots of foolishness anyway. No one in sound mind or body would be dead. Would you like a drink?" "Pardon?" said Mort. He recalled himself and repeated, "Pardon. If you drink, that is. It's raspberry port on the dresser. You might as well finish the bottle." Mort eyed the dresser suspiciously. He felt he'd rather lost the initiative. He pulled out the hourglass and glared at it. There was a little heap of sand left. "There's still a few minutes left," said the witch, without looking up.
"How do you know?"
She ignored him and dried the ink on the front of the candle, sealed the letter with a drip wax, and tucked it under the candlestick. Then she picked up the cat. "Granny Beale will be around directly tomorrow, enough to tidy up, and you're to go with her, understand? And see, she lets Grandma Nutley have the pink marble washstand. She has had her eyes on it for years." The cat yawped knowingly. I haven't got all night, you know," Mort said reproachfully.
"You have, I haven't. There's no need to shout," said the witch.
She slid off her stall, and then Mort saw how bent she was, like a bow. With some difficulty, she unhooked a tall pointed hat from its nail on the wall, skewered it into place on her white hair with a battery of hatpins, grasped 2 walking sticks. She tottered across the floor towards Mort and looked up at him with eyes as small and bright as black currants.
"Shall I need a shawl, do you think? No, I suppose not. I imagine it's quite warm where I'm going."
She peered closely at Mort and frowned.
"You're rather younger than I imagined," she said.
Mort said nothing. Then Goody Hamstring said quietly,
"You know, I don't think you're who I was expecting at all."
Mort cleared his throat. "Who were you expecting, precisely?" he said.
"Death," said the witch simply. "It's part of the arrangement, you see. One gets to know the time of one's death in advance, and one is guaranteed personal attention."
"I'm it," said Mort.
"It?"
"The personal attention. He sent me. I work for him. No one else would have me." Mort paused. This was all wrong. He'd been sent home again in disgrace. His first bit of responsibility, and he'd ruined it. He could already hear people laughing at him. The veil started in the depth of his embarrassment and blared out like a foghorn. "Only this is my first real job, and it's all gone wrong." The scythe fell to the floor with a clatter, slicing a piece of the leg table and cutting a flagstone in half. Goody watched him for some time on one side. Then she said,
"I see. What's your name, young man?"
"Mort," sniffed Mort. "Short for Mortimer."
"Well, Mort, I expect you got an hourglass somewhere around about your person."
Mort nodded vaguely. He reached down to his belt and produced the glass. The witch inspected it critically.
Still a minute or so," she said. "We don't have much time to lose. Just give me a moment to look up."
"But you don't understand," Mort wailed. "I'll mess it all up. I've never done this before." She patted his hand.
"Neither have I," she said. "We can learn together. Now pick up that scythe and try to act your age. There's a good boy."
Against his protestations, she shooed him out into the snow and followed behind him, pulling the door shut and locking it with a heavy iron key which she hung by a nail on the door. The frost had tightened its grip on the forest, squeezing it until the roots creaked. The moon was setting, but the sky was full of hard white stars that made the winter seem even colder. Goody Hamstring shivered.
There's no log over there, she said conversationally. That's quite a good view across the valley. In the summertime, of course. I should like to sit down.
Mort helped her through the drifts and brushed as much snow as possible off the wood. They sat down with the hourglass between them. Whatever the view might have been in the summer, it now consisted of black rocks against the sky from which little flakes of snow were now tumbling. I can't believe all this, said Mort. I mean, you sound as if you want to die.
There are some things I shall miss, she said. But it gets thin, you know. Life, I'm referring to. You can't trust your own body anymore, and it's time to move on. I reckon it's about time I tried something else. Did he tell you that magical folk can see him all the time?
No, said Mort inaccurately.
Well, we can.
He doesn't like wizards and witches that much, Mort volunteered.
Nobody likes a smart ass, he said with some satisfaction. We give him trouble, you see. Priests don't, so we like priests.
You never said that, said Mort.
They're always telling folk how much better it's going to be when they're dead. We tell them could be pretty good right here, but if only they'd put their minds to it.
Mort hesitated. He wanted to say, you're wrong. He's not like that at all. He doesn't care if people are good or bad, so long as they're punctual. And kind to cats, he added. But he thought better of it. It occurred to him that people needed to believe in things. The wolf howled again, so near that Mort looked around apprehensively. Another one across the valley answered. The chorus was picked up by a couple of others in the depth of the forest somewhere. Mort had never heard anything so mournful. He glanced sideways at the still figure of Goody Hamstrings, and then, with a mounting panic, at the hourglass. He sprang to his feet, snatched up the scythe, and brought it around in a two-handed swing. The witch stood up, leaving her body behind.
Well done, she said. I thought you'd missed it for a minute there.
Mort leaned against a tree, panting heavily, and watched Goody walk around the log to look at herself.
She said critically. Time has got a lot to answer for.
She raised her hand and laughed to see the stars through it. Then she changed. Mort had seen this happen before when the soul realized he was no longer bound by the body's morphic field, but never under such control. Her hair unwound itself from its tight bun, changing color and lengthening. Her body straightened up, wrinkles dwindled and vanished. Her grey woolen dress moved like the surface of the sea and ended up tracing entirely different and disturbing contours. She looked down and giggled and changed the dress into something leaf green and clingy. What do you think, Mort? She said. Her voice had sounded cracked and quavery before. Now it suggested musk and maple syrup and other things that set Mort's Adam apple blooming, bobbing like a rubber ball on an elastic band. He managed and gripped the scythe until his knuckles went white. She walked towards him like a snake in a four-wheel drift.
I didn't hear you, she purred.
Very nice, he said. Is that who you were?
It's who I've always been.
Oh, Mort stared at his feet. I'm supposed to take you away, he said.
I know, she said, but I'm going to stay.
You can't do that. I mean, he fumbled over his words. You see, if you stay, you sort of spread out and get thinner until...
I shall enjoy it, she said firmly.
She leaned forward and gave him a kiss as insubstantial as Mayfly's sigh, fading as she did until only the kiss was left, just like a Cheshire cat, only much more erotic. Have a care, Mort, said her voice in his head. You may want to hold on to your job, but will you ever be able to let go? Mort stood idiotically holding his cheek. The trees around the clearing trembled for a moment. There was the sound of laughter on the breeze, and then the freezing silence closed in again. Judy called out to him through the pink mists in his head. He grabbed the second glass and stared at it. The sand was nearly all gone. The glass itself was patterned with lotus petals. When Mort flicked it with his finger, it went Om. He ran across the crackling snow to Binky and hurled himself into the saddle. The horse threw up its head, reared, and launched itself once again toward the stars. Great silent streamers of blue and green flame hung from the roof of the world. Curtains of octarine glow danced slowly and majestically over the disk as the fire of the Aurora Coriolis, the vast discharge of magic from the disk's standing field, earthed itself in the green ice mountains of the hub. The central spire of Cori Celesti, home of the gods, was a 10-mile-high column of cold, coruscating fire. It was a sight seen by few people, and Mort wasn't one of them, because he lay low over Binky's neck and clung on for his life as they pounded through the night sky ahead of a comet trail of steam. There were other mountains clustered around Qa'Rajh. By comparison, they were no more than termite mounds, although in reality each one was a majestic assortment of cols, ridges, faces, cliffs, screes, and glaciers that any normal mountain range would be happy to associate with. Among the highest of them, at the end of a funnel-shaped valley, dwelt the listeners. They were one of the oldest of the Disc's religious sects, although even the gods themselves were divided as to whether the listeners was really a proper religion. And all that prevented their temple from being wiped out by a few well-aimed avalanches was the fact that even the gods were curious as to what it was that the listeners might hear. If there's one thing that really annoys a god, it's not knowing something. It'll take Mort several minutes to arrive. A row of dots would fill in the time nicely. But the reader will already be noticing the strange shape of the temple, curled like a great white ammonite at the end of the valley, and will probably want an explanation. The fact is that the listeners are trying to work out precisely what it was that the Creator said when he made the universe. The theory is quite straightforward. Clearly, nothing that the Creator makes could ever be destroyed, which means that the echoes of those first syllables must still be around somewhere, bouncing and rebounding off in all the matter in the cosmos, but still audible to a really good listener. Eons ago, the listeners had found that ice and chance had carved this one valley into the perfect acoustic opposite of an echo valley, and had built their multi-chambered temple in the exact position that the one comfy chair always occupies in the home of a rabid hi-fi fanatic. Complex baffles caught and amplified the sound that was funneled up the chilly valley, steering it ever inwards toward the central chamber where, at any hour of the day or night, 3 monks always sat, listening. There were certain problems caused by the fact that they didn't hear only the subtle echoes of the first words, but every other sound made on the disc. In order to recognize the sound of the words, they had learned to recognize all the other noises. This called for a certain talent, and a novice was only accepted for training if he could distinguish by sound alone, at a distance of 1,000 yards, which side of a dropped coin landed on. He wasn't actually accepted into the order until he could tell what color it was. And although the holy listeners were so remote, many people took the extremely long and dangerous path to their temple, traveling through frozen, troll-haunted lands, fording swifts of icy rivers, climbing forbidden mountains, trekking across inhospitable tundra in order to climb the narrow stairway that led into the hidden valley, and seek with an open heart the secrets of being. And the monks would cry unto them, "Keep the bloody noise down!" Binky came through the mountain tops like a white blur, touching down in the snowy emptiness of a courtyard made spectral by disco light from the sky. Mort leapt from his back and ran through the silent cloisters to the room where the 88th abbot lay dying, surrounded by his devout followers. Mort's footsteps boomed as he hurried across the intricate mosaic floor. The monks themselves wore woolen overshoes. He reached the bed and waited for a moment, leaning on the scythe, until he could catch his breath. The abbot was small and totally bald, and had more wrinkles than a sack full of prunes. Opened his eyes. "You are late," he whispered, and died. Mort swallowed, fought for breath, and brought the scythe around in a slow arc. Nevertheless, it was accurate enough. The abbot sat up, leaving his corpse behind. "Not a moment too soon," he said in a voice only Mort could hear. "You had me worried for a moment there." "Okay," said Mort. "Only I got to rush." The abbot swung himself off the bed and walked towards Mort through the ranks of his bereaved followers. "Don't rush off," he said. "I always look forward to these talks. What's happened to the usual fellow?" "Usual fellow?" said Mort, bewildered. "Tall chap, black cloak. Doesn't get enough to eat by the look of him," said the abbot. "Usual fellow. You mean Death," said Mort. "That's him," said the abbot cheerfully. Mort's mouth hung open. "Dialogue, do you?" he managed. A fair bit, of course," said the abbot. "Once you get the hang of it, it's only a matter of practice." "It is?" We must be off," said the abbot. Mort's mouth snapped shut. "That's what I've been trying to say," he said. "So if you could just drop me off down in the valley," the little monk continued placidly. He swept past Mort and headed for the courtyard. Mort stared at the floor for a moment, then ran after him in a way which he knew to be extremely unprofessional and undignified. "Now look," he began. "The other one had a horse named Binky, I remember," said Abbot pleasantly. "Did you buy the round off him?" "The round," said Mort, now completely lost. "Whatever, forgive me," said the abbot. "I don't really know how these things are organized, lad." "Mort," said Mort absently, "and I think you're supposed to come back with me, sir, if you don't mind," he added in what he hoped was a firm and authoritative manner. The monk turned and smiled pleasantly at him. "I wish I could," he said, "perhaps one day. Now, if you could give me a lift as far as the nearest village, I imagine I'm being conceived about now." "Conceived? But you just died," said Mort. "Yes, but you see, I have what you might call a season ticket," the abbot explained. Light dawned on Mort, but only very slowly. Oh, he said. "I've read about this reincarnation, yes? That's the word. 53 times so far. Or was it 54? Binky looked up as they approached and gave a short neigh of recognition when the abbot patted his nose. Mort mounted up and helped the abbot up behind him. "It must be very interesting," he said, as Binky climbed away from the temple. "On the absolute scale of small talk, this comment must rate minus quite a lot, but Mort couldn't think of anything better." "No, it mustn't," said the abbot. You think it must be because you believe I can remember all my lives, but of course I can't. Not while I'm alive, anyway." "I hadn't thought of that," Mort conceded. "Imagine toilet training 50 times. Nothing to look back on, I imagine," said Mort. "You're right. If I had my time all over again, I wouldn't reincarnate. And just when I'm getting the hang of things, the lads come down from the temple looking for a boy conceived at the hour of the old abbot died. Talk about unimaginative. Stop here a moment, please." Mort looked down. "We're in mid-air," he said doubtfully. "I won't keep you a minute." The abbot slid down from Binky's back, walked a few steps in thin air, and then shouted. It seemed to go on for a long time. Then the abbot climbed back. "You don't know how long I've been looking forward to do that," he said. There was a village in a lower valley a few miles from the temple, which acted as a sort of service industry. From the air, it was a random scattering of small but extremely well soundproofed huts. "Anywhere will do," the abbot said. Mort left him standing a few feet above the snow at a point where the huts appeared to be the thickest. "Hope the next lifetime improves," he said. The abbot shrugged. "One can always hope," he said. "I get a 9-month break anyway. The scenery isn't much, but at least it's in the warm." "Goodbye, then," said Mort. "I've got to rush." "Au revoir," said the abbot sadly, and turned away. The fires of the hoplights were still casting their flickering illumination across the landscape. Mort sighed and reached for the third glass. The container was silver, decorated with small crowns, and there was hardly any sand left. Mort, feeling that the night had thrown everything at him, couldn't possibly get any worse, turned it around carefully to get a glimpse of the name.